The focus of this lecture is to explore the patriarchal stories. Um, these are the stories from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, but also you get the story of Joseph. And the issue of the patriarchal story is, what function do they serve? Again, we're talking about real people and real events, but the author of Genesis is trying to do something in the retelling of these stories. And one of the important functions of the patriarchal stories is to connect Israel with Abraham. So last time we looked at the primeval history and how the call of Abraham in chapter 12 becomes kind of the response to the Tower of Babel. You end up with the problem of the nations. And how is God going to respond to that? Well, he takes Abraham, and out of Abraham is going to create a nation. And it's important to recognize that as the people of Israel would read the patriarchal stories, they would see themselves in the person of Abraham, that they are the promised descendants that God promised them in Genesis 12, when he says, I will make you a great nation, I will bless you and make your name great, that you'll be a blessing. So you get in that first part of chapter 12, really the promise, and Israel sees themselves as the inheritors of that promise. And they're also going to inherit the role and function of Abraham. So one of the ways we're going to look at these patriarchal texts in this lecture is to read them through the lens of the people of Israel. So if we think about them coming out of Egypt and hearing these stories, they are being connected back to Abraham, with whom God made a covenant, with whom God was going to reclaim the world and deal with the problem of the nations that we find in Genesis chapter 10 and 11 with the Tower of Babel. But we're also going to see that Abraham plays a priestly function, and we'll see that in a couple of different places in the Abraham story, and Israel is going to inherit that priestly function. So really what we see here is that Israel is going to be and do what Abraham is and does. That Israel is the descendants of Abraham, the nation that God is bringing forth, the children of Abraham, but also Israel fulfills the function and purpose of Abraham, as we'll see here in these texts. So we've already talked about Genesis 12, and I don't want to necessarily go over this again, but it's important to see how verses 1 through 9 really is the promise of blessing. It's connected back to Babel. We talked about the name thing. In the Tower of Babel story, the people are saying we'll make a name for ourselves by creating this big tower, this city. And in Genesis 12, God is saying that he would make Abraham's name great. That he would bless them. He'd have descendants, and that he will have land. And we'll see that in the way the covenant gets emphasized. And again, God is going to deal with the problem of the nations through Abraham, and we'll see how that moves also through the people of Israel. Now, what's also important is to see the second half of chapter 12. And this is the story of Abraham and Sarah going into Egypt. And so to show you how this text actually functions in a way in which it's speaking to Israel's experience, and that they are doing and experiencing the same thing that Abram did. Listen to the text. It says, Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, This is his wife. Then they will kill me, they will let you live. Say you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. When the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh in his house with the great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they sent him on his way with his wife and all that he had. Now, again, as you read that text, what you need to be hearing is the story of Israel. So think back to the Genesis 6 text when we talked about the Nephilim and the sons of God and the daughters of men, right? What did they do? In some way, you can interpret that text as saying that the pharaohs, the rulers, saw themselves as the son of the gods. They saw themselves as divine. And here in the text, we find the same thing, that Pharaoh is taking Sarah to be his wife. And this pushes forward into Exodus 1, where Pharaoh is building, and the Egyptians are building these supply cities, and he takes the Hebrew women. He takes the Hebrew midwives. And so you see that Abram, because of a famine, goes down to Egypt, while in Egypt gets wealthy. And verse 17, but the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. Right? And then so Pharaoh gets afflicted with plagues and then sends Abraham away with Sarah and with their possessions. So what we're going to see is this is the story of Israel. Israel ends up in Egypt because of a famine. They end up being enslaved, and the women end up being taken. The plagues happen, and then they're sent out with the wealth of the plunder of Egypt. So right here in this text in Genesis 12, we see how Abraham's journey is Israel's journey. It's a prefiguring of the Exodus. Now, the other thing that we see here is that the patriarchal stories function as kind of this exile and return. And this theme is going to move throughout the biblical story. So Abram goes down to Egypt because of a famine, and then he comes out. We're going to see that Isaac, if you read the Isaac story, same thing. Goes to live among the Philistines because of a famine, and then comes out. We're going to see Jacob, who runs away and lives with Laban and labors for Laban, and then he comes back out. All of this becomes kind of a prefiguring of Israel's experience of the Exodus account. Now, the other important piece as we kind of move through here, we're going to skip over the story of Lot. So they come out, and Abraham and Lot, they separate and so on. But we get to the covenant. And I really want to emphasize these two parts of the covenant that we find in Abraham. And the two parts of the covenant come in Genesis 15 and they come in Genesis 17. Now, what I need you to think about is the suzerain vassal covenant that we talked about way back when. And the suzerain vassal covenant talks and emphasizes how the greater will do something on behalf of the lesser. So there is a greater power who does some action and does it on behalf of the lesser, and the lesser requires obedience. My argument is that we see here in Genesis 15 and 17 these two parts of the covenant. So, chapter 15, verse 1, after these things the word of the Lord came to Abram. Do not be afraid, Abram, I'm your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You've given me no offspring, and so a slave born of my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward the heaven and count the stars, if you're able to count them. Then he said to them, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of Ur, the land of the Chaldeans, to give you this land. But then he said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, and a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in two. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. So here's the scene. The Lord gives the promise to Abraham that he will have descendants and that he will have the land. Abram simply says, How do I know this is going to happen? And so we get this kind of cutting a covenant here. God gives a promise to Abram and then moves to actually symbolize the promise with these actions. He takes these animals, cuts them in half, except for the birds. Now look at verse 12. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land not theirs, shall be slaves there, and they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace, and shall be buried in good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river. And then he lists off all these different rivers. What happens is the animals are cut in half. And in the ancient covenant, what happened was the person who was responsible to keep the covenant would walk through the dead animals, and it would say, if I do not keep my promise, may this happen to me. So what happens is Abraham falls into this kind of sleep, and the torch moves and the pot move through these dead carcasses. The Lord is the one who moves through them. And it's important here to see how Abraham is the one who is passive. God is the one who moves through the dead animals. God is the one promising, who says, I will do this, and if I do not keep my promise, may this happen to me. So again, the passivity of Abraham. Abraham doesn't walk through it. God is the one who walks through it. So as we think about the suzerain vassal covenant, it is the suzerain, the stronger, who says, I will do this for you. So again, salvation is not something Israel or Abraham does on their own. God is the one who enacts salvation. But then we get to Genesis 17, and so we get the other part of the suzerain vassal covenant. And if you would read through this, what you would see again is God makes his promise and makes a covenant to them and says, first of all, changes his name, verse 5, no longer shall your name be Abram, but it'll be Abraham. And then verse 7, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring. And again, promises land. And then verse 9, God said to Abraham, as for you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout your generations. This is my covenant, which you will keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. So circumcision becomes the sign of the covenant. And here's the significant part. Chapter 15, what we get is God is the one who moves through the pots. God is the one who will save. Chapter 17, we see Abraham's responsibility is to be faithful. And so the covenant becomes a sign of faithfulness. They become a marked people. And the covenant then becomes the sign of the promise. So again, I want you to see this in the context of the suzerain vassal. That God is the one who does the saving. God will act. Abraham doesn't save himself. Abraham doesn't keep the promise. God does. But faith isn't just merely kind of assenting to some kind of belief. It is also requires faithfulness. It requires obedience. And circumcision becomes the sign and the mark of obedience. Circumcision doesn't save them. Circumcision becomes the mark that they are God's people and that they will remain faithful to God. They will keep God's word. They will keep God's law. And so here we see the circumcision eventually is going to signify God's law. And we'll look at this in the context of thinking about the law after we do the Exodus account. What is the law? And if we think about the law as kind of the human response, God acts and then God expects his people to live a certain way. We'll see how circumcision becomes a sign of keeping that law, an act of faithfulness, an act of obedience. Keeping it doesn't save you. Keeping it is a part of the faithfulness that we show in obedience to God. And we'll talk about that when we get to the Exodus. But we'll also see that in Paul. So what Paul wants to do is he sees circumcision connected with law is recognize the significance of faith and justification and so on in that context. So when we get to the New Testament, we'll see this pop up again in the book of Galatians. It's also important to recognize Abraham's priestly function. And what that means is that Abraham intercedes for the nations. So think about this. God is calling Abraham to be a blessing to the nations. The problem of the nations is they're all scattered and they're in idolatry. And Abraham is going to be a blessing to them. So we see this in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 18. We see it in that Abraham is going to intercede for Lot and Lot's family, but also intercede for um, Sodom and Gomorrah. So we get in chapter 18, verses 16 through 33, this bartering that takes place between God and Abraham. Now, look, I know some of you will have a problem with this, but we can't just merely put into the text this idea that, well, God knows what Abraham's going to do. The text is trying to get us to see that Abraham is earnestly and honestly interceding on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he's bartering with God in a sense. He stands in between God and the people of Sodom and the people of Gomorrah and Lot and his wife. And we kind of know that story a little bit. We see it again in chapter 20, where Abraham again pawns off his sister. And we get problems with that. But Abimelech, who is the king of a different group of people, becomes ill. And Abraham intercedes. Verse 17 of chapter 20. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves. They bore children. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So again, what you get are these stories of intercession where Abraham stands in between God and the nations and is bringing healing, bringing blessing, and even bringing a certain form of reconciliation. Now, it's important to make this connection with Israel. Chapter 19 of Exodus, the Israelites are on Sinai. We get this notion of the law that's going to be given. And he says, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you've seen what I did to the Egyptians. Now obey my voice, keep my covenant, and you shall be my treasured possession out of all peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and holy nation. Israel is to be a priestly people. That is their function. And we see that here in Abraham. So again, they are fulfilling the role of Abraham. Genesis 22 and the sacrifice of Isaac. Again, we need to place it, I think, within the context of covenant and within the context of faithfulness and obedience. So God speaks his word to Abraham, and Abraham, in many ways, obeys. So the story of Abraham and Isaac is finally the gift that is given to Abraham, going to be the one through whom the people are going to come. God comes to him and says that he has to go sacrifice Isaac. And the narrative is significant. The narrative is significant because it speaks to the faithfulness of Abraham, but it also, in some sense, speaks to this this intercession that we see between God and Abraham. So again, God gives his word to Abraham in chapter 22, sacrifice Isaac, brings Isaac there. Verse 9, when they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar at the top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am. Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything. So the Lord stops him. Verse 14, so Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Now what's important here is, I think, to recognize the faith of Abraham to believe in the promise of God. In some way, Abraham is holding God to his word. We often kind of think of it as God testing Abraham, but we could think of it differently, that Abraham is testing God. God says, we're going to go sacrifice Isaac. Abraham's like, all right, if this is how we're going to play this, I will trust you. I will obey you. Whether or not he believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead, somehow he believed that God would still fulfill his promise. Isaac was going to be the one through whom the nations would be blessed and the people would come. But Abraham, in some way, holds to the promise and trusts in God's word that God would be the one who would, in many ways, provide. So again, it goes back to this whole covenant idea of God's action, and then this notion of Abraham's response, a response of faithfulness. And so again, I think it prefigures the law, this idea of God giving God's word, Israel needing to be obedient. It speaks to the radical nature of faith, I believe, and it also speaks to this notion of the gift. Isaac is a gift. And so Abraham in some ways trusts God, that God would keep his promise and his word, but doesn't cling so tightly to Isaac as the gift, is faithful in what God is calling him to do. Now, as you think about the patriarchs as a whole, it's just important to see how the Abraham story, the Isaac story, and the Jacob story is really about transformation. That Abraham is called out, God gives his word. He's Abram, God gives his word, Abraham believes, and Abram becomes Abraham. He's given a new name, and the names are significant in the Old Testament. They really speak to a person's identity. Here we see that in the giving of a different name, there's a transformation. Genesis 32 is that story that a lot of you are probably familiar with, where Jacob wrestles with the angel. So Jacob is out, he's got to meet Esau, they're on their way, he's trying to run and hide and all of those types of things. He's a conniver. In the same way, like Abraham is really not that much moral of a character. He's pawning his wife off. He's trying to short circuit the whole thing by having sex with Hagar and producing a child Ishmael. And so the patriarchs are not necessarily people that we should hold up as these great moral models. We see the same thing with Jacob. But there's a transformation that happens with Jacob as he is coming back and wrestles with God on the mountain. So the story goes this way. The same night he got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children and crossed the ford at Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything that he had. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he struck him on the hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then the man said, "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans, and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask me my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose up as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites did not eat the thigh muscle that is in the hip socket, because he struck Jacob on the hip socket at the thigh muscle. Here we get this idea of transformation. Jacob, the conniver, becomes Israel, the one who wrestles with God. Now, I think it also speaks to the issue of faith. A lot of times we think faith is about certainty, and yet here in these patriarchal stories, we see that faith is much more about wrestling. That Israel's whole existence is going to be this kind of wrestling with God. And so we see here the beginnings of the patriarch Jacob, whose sons are going to become the tribes of Israel. And it will push us here into the Joseph story. And the Joseph story then becomes the end, of the patriarchal narrative. The story of Joseph being sold into slavery into Egypt and being brought into Egypt and kind of rising in the ranks. Again, we need to see the story of exile and blessing. We need to see the story of enslavement and then freedom in God's providence. That through Joseph's slavery in Egypt, God is working out the salvation of his people. We also need to see that in the Joseph story, you get this kind of interaction between God's sovereignty, God's will, and human freedom. Throughout the entire Genesis story, I always think of it like an orchestra, where the conductor is trying to get the orchestra to play the music, and sometimes the musicians want to play their own thing, so the piccolo player goes off on their own line of music, and the trumpet is doing something else, and the conductor weaves into the composition the things that the piccolo player and the trumpet player are doing and playing. So as we think about these patriarchal narratives and how God is at work in the history and lives of the patriarchs, it becomes this tension, this wrestling that takes place between God's will and the patriarchs. And eventually that becomes the model for the people of Israel. So think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. wrestling with God, sweating blood. Um, Not my will, but yours. I think as we think about Jesus, we'll come back to some of the patriarchs and Israel's experience. So we see at the end of the Joseph story, when Joseph is forgiving his brother, he says, realizing their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back? So you know the story. They come before Joseph, and Joseph finally breaks down. Verse 19, but Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he's doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones. This way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. Again, this text speaks to the tension between providence and freedom. Was it God's will that Joseph be sold into slavery, or was it the brothers' sinful acts that and their freedom that threw him into the pit that brought him into slavery? And the answer is yes, it's both. It's a tension, and God is weaving into his narrative, redemptive story, the actions of individuals, of people, of nations, and so on. Ultimately, what happens here at this story is we now get to the Exodus. We get Israel in Egypt. And that's the whole point of these patriarchal narratives, is to show us how Israel is eventually going to end up there. And they provide the pattern, the thematic pattern of exile and restoration, slavery and freedom. We'll see here this notion of how God's blessing is going to come through Abraham. It's going to come through the people of Israel. But it's going to continue to be this wrestling that happens between the people of Israel and their God.